Louis Pasteur was born on December 27, 1822, in the small town of Dole, located in the Jura region of eastern France. This area, marked by rolling hills, rivers, and a strong rural character, shaped the atmosphere of Pasteur's earliest years. France at the time was still adjusting to the political and social aftermath of the Napoleonic era, and daily life in provincial towns like Dole was defined by modest means, discipline, and respect for craft and labor. Pasteur entered the world far from the elite intellectual centers of Paris, in an environment where practical work and moral responsibility were valued more than abstract theory or social prestige. Pasteur's family background played a decisive role in forming his character. His father, Jean-Joseph Pasteur, was a tanner by trade, a demanding profession that required patience, precision, and physical endurance. Jean-Joseph had also served as a non-commissioned officer in Napoleon's army and was deeply proud of his military service. From this experience, he carried a strong sense of duty, patriotism, and respect for authority. These values were not merely spoken, but lived daily, and young Louis grew up in a household where hard work was seen as a moral obligation rather than a burden. The Pasteur family lived a simple and disciplined life. Their income depended on steady manual labor, and there was little room for luxury or intellectual indulgence. Yet the household was not lacking in ambition or emotional support. Jean-Joseph Pasteur believed deeply in education and personal advancement, even though he himself had not benefited from extensive formal schooling. He encouraged his son to pursue learning seriously, viewing education as a path to service and honor rather than personal glory. This belief would later resonate strongly in Louis Pasteur's devotion to science in the service of humanity. Pasteur's mother, Jeanne-Etiennette Roquy, contributed a different but equally important influence. She was known for her calm temperament, emotional steadiness, and quiet encouragement. While historical records emphasize the father's discipline, the mother's role in providing emotional balance should not be underestimated. In this supportive domestic environment, Pasteur developed a strong sense of loyalty to his family and an enduring respect for moral integrity. These traits would later shape his scientific ethics, particularly his insistence on rigor, honesty, and responsibility in research. In 1825, when Louis was still very young, the family moved from Dole to Arbois, another small town in the Jura region. Arbois would become deeply associated with Pasteur's identity, and he later referred to it as his true home. The town's close-knit social structure, surrounded by vineyards and workshops, reinforced values of perseverance and community. Growing up in such surroundings, Pasteur was not exposed early to scientific brilliance or academic competition, but rather to a worldview grounded in effort, patience, and respect for tradition. This modest beginning is essential to understanding Louis Pasteur's later life. His revolutionary scientific achievements did not emerge from privilege or early intellectual fame, but from a foundation built on discipline, family loyalty, and a profound sense of duty. The moral framework instilled during his childhood years remained with him throughout his career, shaping not only how he worked, but why he worked. For Pasteur, science was never an abstract pursuit. It was a calling rooted in the values of his family and the humble world into which he was born. Louis Pasteur's childhood unfolded in the quiet provincial town of Arbois, where daily life followed steady rhythms shaped by work, family, and community tradition. As a young boy, he did not immediately stand out as a prodigy or future scientist. Instead, he grew up as a careful observer of the world around him. absorbing lessons not from laboratories or books, but from routine, discipline, and close family supervision. The modest scale of Arbois meant that everyone knew one another, and this environment fostered in Pasteur a strong sense of responsibility and personal conduct from an early age. In his earliest years of schooling, Pasteur showed an inclination toward drawing and the arts rather than science. He spent many hours sketching portraits of family members, friends, and local figures, displaying patience and attention to detail well beyond his age. These drawings, some of which still survive, reveal a young mind capable of intense focus and careful observation, skills that would later become central to his scientific method. At this stage, however, there was no clear indication that he would pursue a life in chemistry or biology. Pasteur attended the local primary school in Arbois, where education emphasized discipline, memorization, and moral instruction. Teachers focused on basic literacy, arithmetic, and classical values rather than experimental thinking. Pasteur was described as diligent rather than brilliant, a student who advanced through persistence rather than natural ease. His progress was steady, and he earned the respect of his instructors through seriousness and obedience, qualities highly valued in early 19th century French education. As he grew older, Pasteur continued his studies at the Collège d'Arbois and later at the Collège Royal of Besançon. The transition to more advanced schooling was challenging, particularly as he was separated from his family for longer periods. During this time, Pasteur experienced moments of self-doubt and homesickness, yet these difficulties strengthened his resilience. His academic performance improved gradually, especially in subjects that demanded structure and logical reasoning. While still not exceptional in science, he demonstrated a growing capacity for sustained effort and intellectual discipline. A crucial influence during Pasteur's early education was his father's constant encouragement and strict expectations. Jean-Joseph Pasteur closely followed his son's progress, offering firm guidance and reminding him that education was a form of service to both family and nation. This pressure was not harsh, but deeply motivating, instilling in young Louis the belief that success came from moral strength as much as intelligence. Pasteur internalized this lesson, approaching his studies with a seriousness that would later define his professional life. Before science defined his life, Louis Pasteur expressed himself most naturally through art. During his teenage years in Arbois, drawing was not a casual pastime, but a serious and sustained interest. He devoted long hours to sketching, carefully studying faces, expressions, and proportions with remarkable patience. At a time when many students rushed through their studies, Pasteur lingered over details, revealing a temperament inclined toward precision and observation rather than spontaneity or flair. Pasteur's artistic work focused primarily on portraiture. He drew family members, friends, teachers, and notable local figures, often striving to capture not only physical likeness, but also character and mood. His portraits were realistic, restrained, and deliberate, avoiding exaggeration or decorative excess. This early preference for accuracy over embellishment foreshadowed his later scientific mindset, where truth mattered more than elegance and careful observation outweighed speculation. Teachers and acquaintances recognized Pasteur's talent and discipline in drawing. Some believed he might pursue a career in the arts, and there was nothing unrealistic about such a path in provincial France, where portrait artists were valued members of local society. Pasteur himself took his artistic efforts seriously, preserving his drawings and refining his technique. Unlike idle hobbies, his approach to art involved study, repetition, and self-criticism, habits that would later define his laboratory work. What makes Pasteur's artistic phase especially significant is not merely the talent itself, but the skills it cultivated. Drawing trained his eye to notice small variations in form, light, and structure. It taught him to be patient, to revise his work, and to accept that mastery came through effort rather than inspiration alone. These lessons translated seamlessly into scientific practice years later, particularly in microscopy and experimental observation, where success depended on detecting subtle differences invisible to the careless observer. As Pasteur advanced in his education, academic demands gradually reduced the time he could dedicate to art. Yet he never abandoned it entirely. Even after committing himself fully to science, he retained a deep appreciation for artistic discipline and visual clarity. His scientific notes and diagrams were often neat and carefully structured, reflecting the same concern for order and representation that had guided his youthful sketches. Pasteur's early interest in art reveals an often overlooked dimension of his development. His genius did not emerge suddenly from abstract reasoning or mathematical brilliance, but from a cultivated ability to observe the world closely and faithfully. Art shaped how he looked, how he judged accuracy, and how he respected detail. In this sense, his path to scientific greatness did not begin in the laboratory, but at the drawing table, where patience, truth, and careful seeing first became central to his way of thinking. Louis Pasteur's arrival in Paris marked a decisive turning point in his intellectual life. Leaving behind the familiar rhythms of provincial France, he entered a city that stood at the center of European learning and cultural ambition. Paris in the 1840s was intellectually intense and socially demanding, a place where competition was fierce and academic expectations were uncompromising. For Pasteur, the transition was neither smooth nor immediately triumphant. It was a period marked by struggle, adjustment, and gradual transformation rather than instant success. Pasteur initially enrolled at institutions that prepared promising students for higher education, but the pressure of Parisian academic life weighed heavily on him. He was deeply attached to his family and experienced periods of loneliness and self-doubt during his early months in the capital. Unlike some of his peers, he did not arrive with effortless confidence or a reputation for brilliance. Instead, he relied on discipline and perseverance, slowly adapting to the demanding pace and intellectual rigor of advanced study. His admission to the École Normale Supérieure represented a major achievement and a critical milestone. This elite institution trained future teachers, scholars, and researchers who would shape France's intellectual future. At the École Normale, Pasteur encountered a structured yet stimulating academic environment that emphasized precision, method, and intellectual responsibility. Here, he began to move decisively away from his earlier artistic focus and toward chemistry and physics, fields that rewarded his patience and attention to detail. Under the influence of rigorous instruction and exposure to advanced experimental methods, Pasteur's scientific identity started to take shape. He showed particular strength in crystallography and chemical analysis, disciplines that required careful observation and logical structure. His work during this period reflected a growing confidence and an emerging originality of thought. He was no longer merely absorbing knowledge, but learning how to question, test, and refine ideas through disciplined experimentation. Equally important was the moral atmosphere of the École Normale, which resonated strongly with Pasteur's upbringing. The institution valued seriousness, dedication, and service to the nation, principles that aligned closely with those instilled by his father. Pasteur came to see scientific study not simply as an academic pursuit, but as a responsibility with social and national significance. This belief would later underpin his unwavering commitment to applied science and public health. By the time Pasteur completed his university studies in Paris, he had undergone a profound transformation. The hesitant provincial student had become a disciplined young scientist with a clear sense of purpose. Paris did not merely educate him, it tested his character, refined his methods, and sharpened his ambition. These formative university years laid the intellectual and ethical foundation for the groundbreaking discoveries that would soon redefine medicine, biology, and the relationship between science and society. Louis Pasteur's earliest original scientific research unfolded in the precise and demanding field of crystallography, a discipline that bridged chemistry, physics, and geometry. At a time when many scientists focused on large theoretical systems, Pasteur turned his attention to the minute structure of crystals, believing that truth could be found in careful observation of the smallest details. This choice reflected both his artistic training and his emerging scientific discipline, as crystallography required patience, visual sensitivity, and an almost meditative attention to form. Pasteur's work centered on the study of tartaric acid salts, substances already well known to chemists but not fully understood. Scientists had observed a puzzling phenomenon. Two chemically identical substances could rotate polarized light in opposite directions, while a third, seemingly identical form showed no optical activity at all. This contradiction challenged existing chemical theory and remained unresolved. Pasteur approached the problem not by abstract speculation, but by physically examining the crystals themselves, sorting them one by one under the microscope. In a breakthrough moment, Pasteur observed that certain crystals, though chemically identical, differed subtly in shape. Some were mirror images of others, much like left and right hands. By separating these crystals manually and studying their optical behavior, he demonstrated that molecular asymmetry was responsible for the different optical effects. This insight was revolutionary. It revealed that the spatial arrangement of atoms mattered just as much as their chemical composition, introducing a new way of thinking about molecular structure. What made Pasteur's discovery especially remarkable was not only its originality, but the method behind it. He trusted his eyes, his hands, and his discipline. At a time before advanced instruments could visualize molecules directly, Pasteur inferred invisible structures from visible forms. His work showed that life-related chemistry was fundamentally asymmetric, a conclusion that would later influence biochemistry, molecular biology, and medicine. In this sense, crystallography became the gateway through which Pasteur entered the deeper mysteries of living matter. Pasteur's early success in crystallography earned him recognition within the scientific community and established his reputation as a careful and innovative researcher. Yet he did not treat the discovery as an end point. Instead, it shaped his scientific philosophy, that nature reveals its laws only to those willing to observe patiently and question assumptions. This mindset would guide him as he moved from crystals to fermentation, from chemistry to biology, and ultimately to discoveries that transformed public health. These early studies laid the foundation for Pasteur's lifelong approach to science. Crystallography taught him that great revolutions can emerge from small details and that rigorous observation can overturn long-held beliefs. Long before he became a symbol of modern medicine, Pasteur proved himself as a scientist who could see order where others saw confusion, and meaning where others saw only routine matter. Louis Pasteur's transition from student to professional scientist marked the beginning of a demanding and purposeful academic career. After completing his studies and early research, he entered the world of teaching and institutional science at a time when French universities were undergoing significant transformation. Higher education was expected to serve both intellectual progress and national strength, and young scholars were judged not only by originality, but by discipline and moral seriousness. Pasteur, shaped by years of careful study and personal restraint, fit this ideal precisely. His first academic appointment placed him in an environment where teaching and research were closely linked. Pasteur approached instruction with the same rigor he applied to experimentation, viewing education as a responsibility rather than a routine obligation. He prepared his lectures meticulously, insisting on clarity and accuracy, and expected similar seriousness from his students. Although he was not known for theatrical delivery, his teaching style conveyed conviction and intellectual honesty, earning respect rather than popularity. Pasteur's early academic years were also defined by his continued commitment to research. Rather than separating teaching from scientific inquiry, he treated them as mutually reinforcing activities. His laboratory became both a workspace and a training ground, where students learned not only techniques, but habits of thought. He emphasized careful observation, repetition of experiments, and respect for evidence, instilling a scientific discipline that mirrored his own working methods. Personal life and academic responsibility became closely intertwined during this period. Pasteur's marriage brought emotional stability, allowing him to focus more fully on his professional duties. At the same time, the demands of academic life increased steadily. Administrative tasks, examinations, and public expectations competed with research, forcing Pasteur to develop an exceptional capacity for concentration and time management. Rather than resisting these pressures, he absorbed them into a structured and purposeful routine. As his reputation grew, Pasteur began to be seen not merely as a capable teacher, but as a rising scientific authority. Colleagues recognized his seriousness of purpose and his refusal to accept superficial explanations. He did not seek controversy, yet he did not avoid it when evidence demanded confrontation with established ideas. This combination of restraint and intellectual courage distinguished him from many of his contemporaries and signaled the direction his career would take. Louis Pasteur's studies on fermentation marked a decisive shift in both his own career and the broader direction of modern science. In mid-19th century France, fermentation was a matter of practical importance rather than theoretical curiosity. Wine, beer, and vinegar were essential to the economy, yet producers faced persistent problems such as spoilage and unpredictable quality. These failures were commonly attributed to vague chemical imbalances or spontaneous decay. Pasteur approached the issue with a different mindset, convinced that fermentation was not a purely chemical process, but one deeply connected to living organisms. Pasteur began by examining fermenting liquids under the microscope, an approach that was still uncommon among chemists of his time. What he observed challenged established assumptions. Instead of seeing fermentation as an automatic breakdown of matter, he found that specific microscopic organisms were consistently present during successful fermentation. Yeasts appeared in healthy wine and beer, while different microorganisms dominated spoiled or sour batches. These observations led Pasteur to a bold conclusion. Fermentation was a biological process carried out by living microorganisms, each responsible for a specific chemical transformation. This idea directly contradicted the dominant chemical theories of the era, which treated fermentation as a lifeless reaction triggered by unstable compounds. Pasteur demonstrated that when unwanted microorganisms contaminated a fermenting liquid, the process went wrong. He showed that by controlling temperature, cleanliness, and exposure to air, fermentation could be guided and protected. His experiments proved that microorganisms were not accidental byproducts, but active agents whose presence determined success or failure. Pasteur's work on lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation further strengthened his argument. He demonstrated that different types of fermentation were caused by different organisms, each with distinct characteristics and requirements. This discovery introduced the concept of microbial specificity, the idea that particular microorganisms produce particular chemical outcomes. It was a radical departure from generalized chemical explanations and laid the groundwork for microbiology as a scientific discipline. Beyond theory, Pasteur's fermentation research had immediate practical consequences. He developed methods to prevent spoilage by gently heating liquids to kill harmful microorganisms without destroying the product itself. This process, later known as pasteurization, transformed industries ranging from wine and beer production to milk preservation. For Pasteur, this was not merely technical success, it was proof that science could directly improve everyday life when guided by careful observation and responsibility. Pasteur's studies on fermentation reshaped scientific understanding of life at the microscopic level. They revealed a hidden biological world actively shaping human industry, health, and food supply. More importantly, they marked Pasteur's transition from chemist to pioneer of microbiology. Fermentation became the bridge that led him toward the study of disease, infection, and immunity, setting the stage for discoveries that would ultimately save millions of lives. Louis Pasteur's discovery of the role of microorganisms represented a fundamental shift in how humanity understood the natural world. Until the mid-19th century, invisible life was poorly understood and often dismissed as a secondary effect of decay rather than a driving force. Disease, spoilage, and putrefaction were commonly explained through vague notions of bad air or spontaneous chemical breakdown. Pasteur challenged this worldview by insisting that living agents, though unseen, actively shaped physical and biological processes. Through systematic experimentation, Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms were not randomly generated, but entered environments from the outside and multiplied under suitable conditions. His meticulous laboratory work showed that when nutrient-rich liquids were protected from contamination, they remained unchanged. When exposed, however, they quickly filled with microscopic life. These results undermined the long-standing belief in spontaneous generation, the idea that life could arise naturally from non-living matter without parent organisms. Pasteur's famous experiments with specially designed glass flasks provided clear and convincing evidence. By allowing air to enter while preventing dust and particles from reaching the liquid, he proved that contamination depended on physical contact with microorganisms rather than air itself. The liquid remained sterile until the flask was tilted or broken, allowing microbes to reach it. These demonstrations were simple in appearance, yet devastating to traditional theories. as they showed that life came from life, not from inert matter. Beyond disproving spontaneous generation, Pasteur established that different microorganisms played specific roles. He demonstrated that particular microbes were responsible for fermentation, decay, and contamination, while others were harmless or even beneficial. This insight transformed microorganisms from vague nuisances into identifiable biological agents with distinct behaviors. The microscopic world, once ignored, now appeared organized, purposeful, and deeply connected to human activity. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond chemistry or food production. Pasteur's work suggested that disease itself might be caused by microorganisms invading the body. Although this idea would take time to gain acceptance, it laid the conceptual foundation for the germ theory of disease. By identifying microorganisms as active causes rather than passive byproducts, Pasteur opened a new path for medicine, hygiene, and public health. The discovery of the role of microorganisms stands as one of Pasteur's most transformative contributions. It reshaped scientific thought, overturned centuries-old beliefs, and revealed a hidden biological universe governing processes essential to life. Through patience, precision, and unwavering commitment to evidence, Pasteur made the invisible visible, and in doing so, permanently changed how humanity understood health, disease, and the living world itself. The debate on spontaneous generation stood at the center of 19th-century scientific controversy, and Louis Pasteur emerged as its most determined and influential challenger. For centuries, many scholars believed that life could arise naturally from non-living matter, a view supported by everyday observations of mold appearing on food or insects emerging from decaying material. By Pasteur's time, this belief had evolved into a refined scientific hypothesis, defended by respected figures who argued that microscopic life could originate spontaneously under the right conditions. Pasteur entered this debate not as a polemicist, but as an experimentalist. He was convinced that the question could not be settled through philosophical argument alone, but only through controlled and repeatable observation. His approach was methodical. If spontaneous generation truly occurred, then life should appear in sterile environments isolated from existing organisms. If it did not, the theory would collapse. This framing transformed the debate from speculation into a testable scientific problem. To address it, Pasteur designed a series of elegant experiments using specially shaped glass vessels, later known as swan neck flasks. These flasks allowed air to enter freely while trapping dust and airborne particles in their curved necks. Pasteur filled them with nutrient-rich liquids, boiled them to destroy existing microorganisms, and left them exposed to air. The results were striking. As long as the liquid remained uncontaminated by particles, it stayed clear and lifeless. When the flask was tilted or broken, allowing trapped material to reach the liquid, microbial life rapidly appeared. These experiments struck at the heart of spontaneous generation theory. Pasteur demonstrated that air itself did not generate life. Rather, it carried living organisms from the environment. Life did not emerge from nothing. It came from pre-existing life. His results were reproducible, visually persuasive, and conceptually simple, making them difficult to dismiss. Yet the controversy did not end immediately. Critics questioned experimental conditions, accused Pasteur of bias, or proposed alternative explanations to preserve the old theory. Public scientific debates followed, some intense and highly personal. Pasteur defended his conclusions with calm persistence, repeating experiments, refining methods, and inviting scrutiny. He understood that the issue was larger than a single theory. At stake was the credibility of experimental science itself. If spontaneous generation were true, the foundations of biology and medicine would remain uncertain. If false, a new biological order, governed by continuity, inheritance, and microbial agency, would emerge. The eventual collapse of spontaneous generation marked a turning point in scientific history. Pasteur's victory was not merely intellectual. It reshaped how scientists understood life, contamination, and disease. By proving that microorganisms came from the environment and not from lifeless matter, he cleared the path for the germ theory of disease and modern hygiene. The debate that once divided scientific communities ultimately strengthened them, replacing assumption with evidence and tradition with observation. Pasteur's role in the debate on spontaneous generation exemplified his scientific character. He did not seek conflict, but he did not retreat from it when truth demanded resolve. Through disciplined experimentation and unwavering respect for evidence, he helped end one of the oldest misconceptions in science. In doing so, he reaffirmed a principle that would guide biology ever after. Life begets life, and even the smallest organisms follow laws as precise as those governing the stars. The development of the pasteurization process emerged from Louis Pasteur's determination to solve practical problems using scientific insight. In mid-19th century France, wine and beer producers faced recurring economic losses due to souring and spoilage. These failures were often blamed on poor craftsmanship or mysterious chemical instability. Pasteur, however, recognized that the root cause lay in microbial contamination, an invisible threat that could be controlled rather than endured. Pasteur approached the problem with a clear experimental strategy. He examined spoiled beverages under the microscope and identified harmful microorganisms distinct from those involved in healthy fermentation. His conclusion was both simple and revolutionary. If these unwanted organisms could be eliminated without damaging the liquid itself, spoilage could be prevented. The challenge lay in achieving this balance. Excessive heat ruined flavor and quality, while insufficient heat allowed microbes to survive. Through careful testing, Pasteur discovered that gently heating liquids to a specific temperature for a controlled period could destroy harmful microorganisms without altering taste or nutritional value. This method differed fundamentally from boiling, which was already known but unsuitable for delicate products. Pasteur's approach was precise and deliberate, reflecting his broader scientific philosophy that control, not force, was the key to mastering natural processes. The process soon demonstrated its effectiveness beyond wine and beer. Milk, a staple food particularly vulnerable to contamination, proved to be an ideal application. By reducing the microbial load, pasteurization dramatically lowered the risk of disease transmission and extended shelf life. Although resistance existed, some critics feared it interfered with nature or reduced quality. Evidence consistently supported its benefits. Gradually, producers and public authorities began to adopt the method. Pasteur himself did not view pasteurization as a personal triumph, but as an example of science serving society. He insisted that knowledge carried moral responsibility and that scientific discoveries should improve public welfare. The process reflected this belief, transforming laboratory insight into a practical safeguard for millions of people. Pasteurization became one of the earliest demonstrations of applied microbiology on an industrial scale. The lasting impact of pasteurization extends far beyond its original context. It reshaped food safety standards, influenced public health policy, and reinforced the idea that microorganisms could be controlled through informed intervention. In developing this process, Pasteur bridged the gap between theory and daily life, proving that careful observation and disciplined experimentation could protect communities as effectively as they advanced knowledge. Louis Pasteur's research on silkworm diseases marked one of the most challenging and socially significant phases of his career. In the mid-19th century, France's silk industry was in crisis. Silkworm populations were collapsing across entire regions, threatening the livelihoods of thousands of farming families and undermining a vital national industry. The causes of the disaster were poorly understood, and many believed the decline was inevitable. Pasteur, though not a specialist in entomology or agriculture, was asked to intervene because of his growing reputation for solving practical problems through scientific rigor. Pasteur approached the crisis with caution and humility. He openly admitted his lack of experience with silkworms, yet he brought with him a powerful method: disciplined observation guided by experimentation. He immersed himself in the daily realities of silkworm breeding, traveling to affected regions, studying living conditions, and observing the insects at every stage of their life cycle. Rather than relying on theory alone, he worked closely with breeders, learning from their experience while applying laboratory precision to their problems. Through microscopic examination, Pasteur identified that many diseased silkworms carried abnormal corpuscles, later understood as infectious agents. He demonstrated that certain diseases were transmitted from one generation to the next through infected eggs, while others spread through environmental contamination. This distinction was crucial. It showed that not all silkworm diseases had the same cause or required the same solution. By separating infected stock from healthy populations, the spread could be halted. Pasteur developed a systematic method for disease prevention rather than cure. He recommended rigorous inspection of silkworm eggs using microscopes, ensuring that only healthy stock was used for breeding. This approach demanded patience, training, and discipline, but it proved effective. Entire silk-producing regions slowly began to recover as breeders adopted Pasteur's recommendations. His method transformed sericulture from a practice based on tradition and guesswork into one guided by scientific control. The success of Pasteur's silkworm research had broader implications. It reinforced the idea that microorganisms could cause disease not only in humans, but in animals and insects as well. This realization strengthened the emerging germ theory and demonstrated its practical value across biological systems. Pasteur showed that understanding the invisible world of microbes could protect entire industries and communities. Perhaps most importantly, this episode revealed Pasteur's unwavering commitment to service. Despite physical exhaustion and declining health during this period, he persisted, driven by a sense of duty rather than personal ambition. His work on silkworm diseases stands as a powerful example of science applied in the face of crisis, where careful observation, perseverance, and moral responsibility combined to restore hope and stability to a struggling nation. Louis Pasteur's turn toward vaccine research marked a profound evolution in his scientific mission. Having demonstrated that microorganisms caused fermentation and disease, he began to ask a more ambitious question. If microbes were responsible for illness, could they also be controlled in a way that protected life rather than threatened it? This shift was not sudden. but emerged gradually from years of experimentation, observation, and growing confidence in the germ theory. Pasteur's attention moved from understanding disease to preventing it, transforming science into a proactive force. The conceptual foundation for vaccine research came from Pasteur's insight into attenuation, the weakening of microorganisms under specific conditions. While studying bacterial cultures, he noticed that microbes exposed to air, heat, or time sometimes lost their ability to cause severe disease while still retaining their biological identity. This observation suggested a revolutionary possibility. Weakened microbes might train the body to resist future infection. It was a radical extension of his earlier work, blending microbiology with emerging ideas about immunity. Pasteur's first major breakthrough in this direction occurred during his studies of animal diseases. Through carefully controlled experiments, he showed that animals exposed to attenuated forms of certain pathogens became resistant to stronger, more dangerous strains. These results were striking not only for their effectiveness, but for their reproducibility. Pasteur insisted on strict experimental conditions, documenting each step to ensure that results were grounded in evidence rather than chance. This discipline distinguished his vaccine research from earlier, less systematic attempts at disease prevention. The transition to vaccine research was not without resistance. Many physicians and scientists remained skeptical, uneasy with the idea of deliberately introducing disease-causing organisms into healthy bodies. Pasteur confronted these doubts with data, demonstrations, and public trials. He understood that acceptance depended not only on success, but on transparency. His willingness to expose his methods to scrutiny reflected both scientific confidence and moral accountability. As Pasteur advanced in this new direction, his work began to blur the boundaries between laboratory science and medicine. Vaccine research demanded collaboration with veterinarians, physicians, and public authorities, expanding Pasteur's role beyond that of a chemist or microbiologist. He increasingly viewed science as a collective effort, one that required trust, communication, and social responsibility. Prevention, in his view, was the highest achievement of scientific knowledge. Turning toward vaccine research completed a critical transformation in Pasteur's career. He moved from explaining natural processes to reshaping them in the service of life. This phase laid the groundwork for his most celebrated achievements and permanently altered medical practice. By demonstrating that disease could be anticipated and prevented, Pasteur helped usher humanity into an age where science no longer merely observed suffering, but actively worked to eliminate it. Louis Pasteur's work on vaccines for anthrax and chicken cholera marked the moment when his ideas about microorganisms and immunity were transformed into dramatic public proof. By the late 19th century, livestock diseases were a constant threat to agriculture, destroying herds and livelihoods with alarming speed. Anthrax in particular was feared for its sudden outbreaks and high mortality, while chicken cholera devastated poultry farms across Europe. Pasteur recognized that these diseases offered an opportunity to demonstrate, beyond the laboratory, that scientific prevention was possible. Pasteur's first decisive step came through his studies of chicken cholera. While cultivating the responsible bacteria, he observed that older cultures lost their ability to cause severe disease. Chickens inoculated with these weakened microbes became mildly ill, but recovered quickly. More importantly, when later exposed to fresh, virulent bacteria, they did not fall ill at all. Pasteur realized that accidental aging of the cultures had produced attenuation, providing protection without lethal consequences. This insight became a cornerstone of vaccine development. Building on this success, Pasteur turned to anthrax, a far more dangerous and economically significant disease. Unlike chicken cholera, anthrax affected large animals such as sheep and cattle, and skepticism toward vaccination was intense. Pasteur prepared weakened forms of the anthrax bacteria and proposed a public experiment to prove their effectiveness. This was a bold move. Failure would damage not only his reputation, but confidence in the entire concept of vaccination. In 1881, Pasteur conducted a highly publicized trial in which groups of sheep were vaccinated or left untreated before being exposed to anthrax. The results were unmistakable. The unvaccinated animals died, while the vaccinated ones survived. This demonstration electrified the scientific community and the public alike. It provided clear, visible evidence that immunity could be artificially induced through controlled exposure to weakened pathogens. The success of these vaccines had profound implications. They confirmed that immunity was not mysterious or accidental, but could be produced deliberately through scientific intervention. Pasteur showed that the body could be trained to defend itself, turning disease into a source of protection rather than destruction. This principle would later become fundamental to modern immunology and preventive medicine. Pasteur's vaccines for anthrax and chicken cholera represented more than isolated triumphs. They symbolized a new relationship between humanity and disease, one based on understanding rather than fear. By applying rigorous experimentation to real-world problems, Pasteur demonstrated that science could safeguard life on a large scale. These achievements solidified his legacy as a pioneer who transformed theory into action and knowledge into lasting protection. Louis Pasteur's work on rabies represented the most dramatic and emotionally charged chapter of his scientific life. Rabies was among the most feared diseases of the 19th century, almost always fatal once symptoms appeared and associated with intense suffering. Unlike earlier diseases Pasteur had studied, rabies could not be easily observed under the microscope, and its causative agent remained invisible to contemporary instruments. This made the challenge far greater, pushing Pasteur beyond established methods into new experimental territory. Pasteur approached rabies through a series of carefully staged experiments on animals, particularly dogs and rabbits. He discovered that the disease was linked to the nervous system and could be weakened by drying infected spinal tissue under controlled conditions. By systematically reducing the virulence of the pathogen through time, Pasteur developed a graduated treatment protocol. This method aimed not to cure rabies once fully developed, but to prevent the disease from taking hold after exposure, a revolutionary idea at the time. The true test of the rabies vaccine came in 1885 with the case of a young boy who had been severely bitten by a rabid dog. Faced with near-certain death if untreated, Pasteur made the agonizing decision to administer his experimental vaccine to a human patient, despite not being a physician. Over several days, the boy received progressively stronger doses of the weakened virus. He survived. This outcome sent shockwaves through the scientific world and captured public imagination across Europe and beyond. The success of the rabies treatment transformed Pasteur into an international figure. Newspapers reported the story widely, and patients from many countries traveled to France seeking protection. Pasteur was celebrated not only as a scientist, but as a humanitarian whose work directly saved lives. Honors, Awards and public tributes followed, reflecting a global recognition that his discoveries had reshaped medicine itself. This wave of international support led to the founding of the Pasteur Institute, an institution dedicated to research, treatment, and education in microbiology and infectious disease. It embodied Pasteur's lifelong belief that science should serve humanity. The institute quickly became a global center for medical research, training generations of scientists who extended Pasteur's legacy far beyond his own lifetime. The rabies vaccine crowned Pasteur's career with both scientific triumph and moral significance. It demonstrated that even the most terrifying diseases could be confronted through knowledge, discipline, and courage. In achieving international recognition, Pasteur did not merely gain fame, he helped establish a new global faith in science as a force capable of protecting life itself. In the final years of his life, Louis Pasteur stood as one of the most revered figures in global science, yet his daily existence was marked by physical limitation and quiet perseverance. Repeated strokes had weakened his body and restricted his mobility, forcing him to work more slowly and rely on close collaborators. Despite these challenges, his intellectual presence remained strong. Pasteur continued to guide research, review experiments, and shape scientific priorities, especially through the institution that bore his name. His later years were not a retreat from science, but a transition into mentorship and vision. The Pasteur Institute became the focal point of this final phase. Pasteur saw it not merely as a laboratory, but as a living extension of his ideals. Within its walls, research, education, and medical treatment were united under a single purpose: the protection of human life through scientific knowledge. Pasteur followed its work closely, even when illness confined him to limited activity. He took pride in seeing younger scientists expand upon his ideas, applying microbiology to new diseases and new contexts across the world. Public recognition continued to grow during these years. Pasteur received international honors, medals, and delegations from foreign governments, universities, and scientific societies. Yet he remained personally modest, often uncomfortable with excessive praise. To him, recognition mattered only insofar as it strengthened trust in science itself. He believed that the true measure of his work lay not in ceremony, but in lives saved and suffering prevented. This ethical outlook remained consistent until the end of his life. Louis Pasteur died on September 28, 1895, at the age of 72. His death was widely mourned, not only in France but across the international scientific and medical community. The funeral was a national event, reflecting the deep connection between Pasteur's achievements and France's sense of scientific and moral progress. He was laid to rest in a crypt beneath the Pasteur Institute, a symbolic resting place surrounded by the work to which he had devoted his life. Pasteur's scientific legacy extends far beyond his individual discoveries. He transformed how humanity understands disease, proving that invisible microorganisms could be identified, controlled, and prevented. His work laid the foundations of microbiology, immunology, and modern public health. Practices such as vaccination, sterilization, and hygiene trace their intellectual origins directly to his research and methods. Perhaps most enduring is Pasteur's model of what a scientist could be. He combined rigorous experimentation with moral responsibility, refusing to separate knowledge from its consequences. His famous belief that science belongs to humanity was not a slogan, but a guiding principle. In this sense, Louis Pasteur's legacy is not only scientific, but ethical. A reminder that the pursuit of truth carries with it an obligation to serve life itself.